Okay. Welcome to the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery programming series for our current show, Sequence, curated by Christine DePiro Abbott. Today, we are thrilled to present the artist, Charles Beneke. As a brief reminder, everyone tuning in today is in listen-only mode, so feel free to utilize that chat function to ask questions, and we'll be sure to get to them at the end of the talk. Also, please keep in mind that because we're presenting from separate locations, there might be some variation of bandwidth, so if one of us freezes up or the sound fluctuates, thanks in advance for bearing with us. All right, thanks everyone, and welcome, Charles.
Thank you. Are we all ready to go? Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Kat and Panayota, and especially Christine Despiro Abbott for curating the exhibit and giving me this opportunity to exhibit at the Rife Gallery with such a fantastic group of colleagues. So, all right, working on advancing.
Go ahead and use your mouse and click onto your presentation, and it will, there you go, perfect.
I'm having trouble finding my mouse. I apologize. It won't appear.
It's advancing now, so you should be good to go.
It is? Okay, excellent. Sorry about that, y'all. So yeah, my name is Charles Beneke, and I'm a professor of art and printmaking at the University of Akron-Myers School of Art, where I've been teaching for 23 years. Prior to that, I taught at the University of Wyoming, and before that, I worked in graphic design, specifically book cover design in New York City. So that's a quick backstory. I grew up in Suffolk, Virginia. So Suffolk is in the Tidewater region on the North Carolina border, very close to the beach. I grew up around tidal marshes, rivers, peanut fields with the smell of pine trees and boxwood all around me. I grew up in a big family, and family was really important. But for my family, as far as the arts go, music played a bigger role initially in my life. I grew up playing the piano. This is me and my mom. My mom played the piano, but even more importantly, she was a really avid listener to classical music. She had speakers in the ceiling of our house and the kitchen in the 1970s, which was kind of a big thing back then. And the house was always shaking with Tchaikovsky and Rachmaninoff. She played the piano beautifully. If you came home and you heard the house shaking, you knew there was something good going on. But it was even better if you walked in and she was playing the piano. And you would just sort of sit down and listen to her play for maybe 15 minutes before the piece ended. And it was an incredible moment to have. And I think that perhaps that's one of the reasons that things that are ethereal, things that flow, things that you really can't grasp have become so important to me in my as a driver in my work. So even when working with the landscape, thinking about those moments where you capture something that's just perfect, or maybe it's just a feeling that you're capturing that of the atmosphere around you, rather than specifically the things that you're observing. So thinking a little bit more about the word flow, which I just mentioned, there's several different definitions. So the action or fact of moving along in a steady, continuous stream. So we could think about fluids or gases, things that are intangible, maybe seem uncontainable. We can think about this is sort of a noun, a steady, continuous stream of something. So it could be like time, or being fully immersed in a place, in a flow state, being really focused. Or perhaps, excuse me, I have to move my panel. Well, anyway, it could be that it's the change in form of something that's solid without it melting. So over the years in my artwork, this is some work from graduate school where I was thinking about things like how do we understand what is actually happening with our bodies and what's happening with our mental states. Um, how do we I'm sorry, y'all. I'm having some technical difficulties, but we're in for the ride. Thinking about identity and how um, we are born with a specific identity registered in our DNA, but that identity is also changing all the time with all of the different experiences that we have in life. So this is an image or a series of images. The arrangement is based upon how DNA is categorized. Or perhaps how we are constantly feeding our bodies, but we're also feeding our souls with the experiences that we are taking in every moment of every day. And how and as far as identity and how that's evolving, how like water, our identities can be calm, we could be violent, we can find ourselves in moments of healing or being destructive as individuals. While I sometimes question whether the diversity in my work might seem unfocused to some, the constant thread is the desire to work with and represent intangible things in life that flow through and around us. Whether these things are beautiful or challenging, I ask myself and my viewer to reflect upon how we handle these things that are hard to identify, difficult to grasp, that seem immalleable. I find myself grateful every day for the individuals who helped form me, who helped me become who I am. Malcolm Moore, who was my art teacher at Woodbury Forest School where I went to boarding school. Claudia Esslinger, Martin Garhart, Barry Gunderson, Karen Snoffer, Kay Willens, all at Kenyon College, who were incredibly pivotal in helping me become the person that I am. Lori Sloan and Gus Mazaka at the University of Connecticut. It's the desire to help others forward as these individuals helped me. Um, and it's what brought me to teaching. And it's my belief that we must all do the same for society and the natural world that flows through us and through my art practice. So we'll start by thinking about the action or fact of moving along in a steady, continuous stream, how my work has flowed over the course of my life. So I mentioned that I grew up in Southern Virginia. I was always around water. I grew up on a lake that was a dammed up tidal river and very close to the beach. Um, I've always been fascinated by water and the many faces that it has, that it can be so placid or it can be so violent, that it can be really soothing, it can be energizing, it can be destructive. It can be so many different things while it's still very much the same object, for lack of a better word. I am fascinated by the sky and the environment's continuous change around us, how whether it's with light or changes in the direction of the wind, that things are changing around us all the time. So the environment has always been important in my work. So I started to feel as though uh, I should be speaking about that importance to me in a more specific way after Katrina, when I was working with the landscape a lot, but we were starting to see changes in weather patterns, in the force of hurricanes, in the frequency. Hurricanes had always been a part of my life growing up on the East Coast, but there was this dramatic change. And I felt like if the natural world was so important to me, then it was my responsibility to better understand it. At that time, the melting of the polar ice caps was very big in the news, and I felt like I wanted to see if I could understand these huge changes that we can't necessarily see in our everyday lives in every moment. So I wrote a grant to travel to Greenland and see if I could see for myself in the polar ice caps um, climate change, where it was being so discussed in the media at that time. So I started by flying from Boston to Iceland, and then in a prop plane back from Iceland to Greenland, where I don't actually think we flew. It was more like we vibrated from one place to another. I flew to a town called Ilulissat on the Disco Bay on the west coast of Greenland. And it was there that my world just opened up completely to this place of rock and ice. Really magical lighting here. We're looking at images during the midnight sun. Um, and I was able to travel to the Jacobshaven Ice Fjord, which is a World Heritage Site. It's a long fjord where there is a moraine at the mouth of the fjord as it empties into the Disco Bay. And what happens is the icebergs that have calved get hung up on this moraine until they melt enough that they can pass through. So you have this vast landscape that seems so solid, but it's actually very fluid. It's slowly flowing out to sea. It was really fascinating to me because the experience of that flow, of that movement, was hard to put your finger on, because if you were looking straight forward, you felt as if something out of your left-hand field of vision seemed like it moved, but then you looked over at that thing that you thought was moving, and it was perfectly steady, but then it felt like something over to the right was moving. So even in this sort of massive epic landscape where things seem so solid and fixed, there was a movement and flow. From there, I was able to travel from Ilulissat up to Ekli, which is it was I think it was about a 4-hour boat ride. Um, I was a little bit disappointed because a lot of the time when I was in Greenland, the weather was pretty gray. And I was really looking forward to seeing all of everything in the beautiful light. But this was a moment where I realized that, when when light is sort of dimmed down, colors can become really brilliant and gorgeous in their subtlety, just like with the subtle blues in this iceberg. We were able to motor up to the face as close as we could get safely of the glacier and watch it calve into the bay there before traveling just a little bit to the right of where we were just looking to these tiny little cabins, which were the base camp of the polar explorer Paul Emile Victor. While staying there, I was able to hike up on the moraine and look at the glacier from above and watch it calve. And then the following day, when the sun did come out and it was incredibly brilliant, hike with two guides up to the polar ice sheet and get to hike onto it. And it was just an incredibly magical experience because I was seeing something that I, had only dreamed of being able to see, but there were so many surprises. Like as you're walking along, suddenly you realize you're on the ice sheet before it seems really visible because the ground is sort of glowing beneath you with the ice that's under all of the rocks that have been displaced by the movement of the glacier. And then these beautiful formations called cryoconites in the ice that were really important. We had to be watching for the cryoconites because they only form in ice, not on snow. So if you knew you were walking on ice, you were safe. If you walked on snow, there could possibly be a crevasse beneath you that you could fall into. So thankfully, I had very experienced guides who were sort of testing the ground that we were walking on continuously. And suddenly you're just completely surrounded by ice and snow on the ice sheet. And one of the things that I noticed were the formation of small pools. And those small pools started to form rivers, gathering larger and larger. And those rivers would eventually plunge to the base of the ice sheet in these huge drainage tubes. And what would happen is the base of the ice sheet gets lubricated by all of this water, causing the ice sheet to move faster, causing the face of the glacier to calve faster. And it's there that I was able to see climate change for myself. So on the left-hand side here, we see an image from when Paul-Émile Victor was a polar explorer. And you can see the mountain in the background on the right is when I was there. So you can see how the ice sheet has begun to move more and more quickly, and the face of it has receded far behind this mountain that we see in the background. And then the thing that was really profound to me were the cryogenites. These beautiful circles, perfectly cylindrical circles that form in the ice, are created by particulates from the atmosphere that are falling onto the ice sheet. And because they are darker in color, they draw more heat and they melt down into the ice. And as those particulates gather, they become larger and larger. So those particulates are pollution that is the effect of our industry that we are seeing falling on the ice sheet and creating profound, rapid change. So a quote that I've always found interesting about art, and that's really driven me, is by Ernst Fischer. And he said, in a decaying society, art, if it is truthful, must also reflect decay. And unless it wants to break faith with its social function, art must show the world as changeable and help it to change. And I think that last phrase is the most important part, is that we have the responsibility of helping to affect change. And I would say positive change, most importantly. As an aside, Ernst Fischer was one of his pseudonyms was Der Maischmacher. My German is non-existent, so forgive me for that. But that translates to the killjoy, which I think is really funny because when I was giving a lecture on my work and talking about this adventure once, after the lecture, a young woman raised her hand in the audience and very hesitantly asked if there was anything positive about my work. And it made me laugh, but it sort of like made me realize that, yes, this is all very heavy. If we're talking about the destruction of our climate, but I think there is something very positive about it, and it's that I'm using my voice to try to affect change. I am doing what I can to help the world forward. And while I may be talking about things that are challenging, that are difficult to grasp, difficult to stomach, that's a very positive thing. So when I returned from this trip, I produced an installation at the University of Akron in the Honors College, and it was a 3-month exhibition. I didn't really want my work to just be static. I wanted it to keep viewers' interest over the course of that 3 months. And so what I decided to do was make the installation change in the same kind of way that we're seeing our climate change. So there was a really long wall of a running repeat pattern of smokestacks and plumes of pollution that extended across the wall that initially might appear kind of floral because of what we're used to seeing in a repeated wallpaper pattern. So that pattern moved along a wall. There were paintings of smoke plumes, and then a large sort of knitted smoke cloud that was hung across the ceiling. As the exhibition moved through time, I slowly pulled the knitted smoke plume apart. And at the same time, I was screen printing the knitted pattern over the wallpaper panels and replacing them, so that over time there was this accumulation of sort of the kind of pall that we're casting across the world through the installation, and then replacing the paintings of the smoke plumes with paintings of the surface of the water, trying to reference all of that melt. So I was talking a lot about the accumulation of particulates and greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, talking about the movement of the jet stream at this point in my work, and pairing that with diagrams that chart the increase in greenhouse gases. These are some images of smoke plumes that are created through a process called fumage, which is where you run a candle over the surface of the paper, and the carbon from the smoke deposits onto the paper and creates the drawing. So I was drawing through stencils. I liked the idea that I was taking carbon from a burning candle to create the smoke plumes, and sort of take things from the environment that are kind of most ephemeral representations of our industry. Smoke plumes are constantly dissipating and disappearing, but sort of trying to question what happens when the things that are most ephemeral are actually the most solid contributor to the problems that we're seeing in the current climate disaster. So thinking a lot about this sort of pall that we're casting across the world, casting over the ice sheet. The pattern that you see beneath hexagons is the shape of the crystal structure of ice. So sort of playing around with talking about how our industry is there are effects of our industries that are far beyond where we think they are. Thinking about how the repetition in the patterns that we have as individuals, but also collectively as a society, are sort of blooming and sowing the seeds for the current climate disaster. At that time, I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to do an exhibit at the Akron Art Museum, and the curators there were gracious enough to allow me to really run with it. And rather than hang a series of prints, create a large-scale print-based installation. So this is a work called Spectre, which consisted of about 36 feet of running repeat pattern that evolves over as it moves from left to right. But we see it repeated moving up the wall. So talking about a transition over time, but talking about how it's not just doing something once, it's the repetition that creates the problem. And then eventually having that wallpaper spiral off the wall to create this huge sort of demon kind of smoke cloud that comes around the room and faces the viewer. So it was created out of, I was screen printing on Tyvek, which is really great to work with because it's stable. So I'm able to print multiple layers on it without it changing shape, and that way I'm able to get really nice registration. But one of the nice things about it is it's recyclable. You can package it up and send it back to be recycled, which I haven't actually done because I just continue to reuse a lot of these pieces up until this point. So this is that wall where I'm talking about sort of the transition from pre-industrial times through the Industrial Revolution, and sort of coursing across to present time. I was working with redrawing a lot of works from pre-industrial times. So the trees on the left are redrawings of some of Durr's trees. And some of the forms that are in the actual smoke cloud are from his work as well. So thinking back about that question that that student asked, is there anything positive about my work? I think it's really great to have a message that you're conveying to people, but if you're leaving them feeling paralyzed and actionless, that leaves people feeling as though there's nothing they can do about this, and that's really heavy. So this piece in the center is Trade Your Carbon for Art wall, where I bound an artist's book and placed some shelves on the wall with components and prints that I had made, and invited the viewer to take one of my works of art if they would sign a commitment in this book, documenting how they were going to change some of their habits to reduce their carbon footprint. So shifting gears slightly, thinking more about, rather than that action, thinking about being sort of consuming a steady, continuous stream of something. So at this time, this is around 2016, we were seeing a lot of changes in the political climate of our country. And one of the things that I found myself continuously asking is, why have we not learned from the mistakes of the past? And I was thinking about artists like Goya with his series of the disasters of war, which were a visual protest against the violence of the 1808 Dos de Mayo uprising and the subsequent Napoleonic occupation of Spain during the Peninsular War, which was from 1808 to 1814. These images were not published until much later, but they documented the atrocities that he saw. Or thinking about Honoré Daumier, the French have such a fantastic tradition in their culture of caricature and using humor to critique government and society, and in this case, the monarchy. So here, Daumier has presented us with the king, Louis Philippe, represented as Gargantua, just sort of gobbling up the income and the well-being of the everyday person living in France at that time, so that he could live more comfortably. And that the crown was in control of everything. Or thinking about Kathy Kollwitz, this is a piece called The Prisoners. It's from a series of etchings, but this is a representation of the prisoners during the peasant wars. So one of the things I love about this image, which is probably a hard one to love, but it's so beautiful, even though it's really challenging content, is one of the things that I find fascinating is just the composition, how we have this swath of people who are imprisoned, who are being repressed, and how everybody's head is kind of the same height, even though their necks, they might not be the same height in real life. They feel as though they're being weighed down by that negative space above them, being this imprisoned, the subjects of oppression. Or thinking about Sandow Burke, who just a short time before had done a series of large-scale woodcuts. They were all 4 feet tall by 8 feet wide. This is a section of one. He was working with Goya's disasters of wars, kind of a response to it in the contemporary time, talking about the depravities of war. And here we see the prisoner who became so well known because of this representation that we saw of him in the media constantly, as he was being interrogated and tortured at Abu Ghraib. So I find myself asking, how do we understand this kind of darkness that we're living through? How do we define it? What is it that we can do with it? How do we handle these things that are so difficult? It's not responsible just to create unstable social structures where we just sort of push them aside and pretend like they don't exist, because those structures won't stand. So as an artist, a person who creates work, who makes more, at this time in our world where waste is such a problem, one of the things that I think is a little bit challenging is, what does it mean to be somebody who makes in a time where capitalist consumption is a problem? So this is a quote by Dylan Miner, who was one of the founders of an artist collaborative called Just Seeds. And he says, in a world of late capitalist consumption, where mass-produced commodities and highly designed products are naturalized, the creation of handmade objects becomes an overt act of resistance. And this sort of made me think a little bit about the importance of printmaking's role in democracy. If you think about the printing press, arguably one of the most important inventions of all time, it was the main form of communication for 400 to 500 years before the invention of the radio. So print helping communicate with people and helping people come together to fight for things that they believe in, but also printmaking as a democratic form in the sense that it's artwork that's more affordable. So it's not just the super wealthy who are able to afford really beautiful paintings, but maybe they can also, everyday individuals can afford a print. So a way of getting artwork into the hands of everyone. So I was thinking a lot about the work that I was producing and how I should be using my voice to help affect change. So this was a tabloid that I did as a part of a portfolio, which was, again, working with the smoke plumes and superimposing climate change denial text within those clouds, because that's as much pollution as what we are putting out into the atmosphere. Thinking about how I can invite people to consider the ways that they are polluting the environment and take responsibility for it. I was creating posters speaking out for the things that I believe in, that voicing the importance of standing up and using your voice for what you think is right. For a brief period of time, I was spending the week working on designing a poster, and then during that weekend, I would screen print the poster, and then I would distribute them the following week while I was designing the next poster. And while I was not able to continue that as long as I would like, the production of posters that push people to think about things that I think are important, like in this one, how we use language, but also the importance of voting, y'all being inclusive rather than saying you guys, at a time where it's really important that we become more inclusive and understanding of people's identities. Pushing people to vote, um, although this one might also push people to have problems with vertigo. But I would often use these prints as opportunities to do demonstrations in my printmaking classes. So here you see an image where I was using a lot of transparent color to talk to students about how printing colors, if you print 4 colors, you don't end up with just 4 colors. If you work with transparency, you end up with a lot more. This is a letterpress poster. So I was often really trying to demonstrate the importance of being socially active to my students. So thinking a little bit about influences, my influences really come from everywhere. So it could be parking in the parking lot behind the Myers School of Art, where every morning for a number of years I saw a smoke plume billowing into the sky. I am a huge fan of Durr, and as somebody who's worked a lot with clouds and smoke in my work, I'm fascinated with the way he uses them to as a narrative device. It's almost like a graphic novel where we have the bars of white that are separating each frame that we have in a comic book, maybe, but they're creating breaks so that you can talk about many different parts of a story all within the same point. Or seeing those same kind of things in the natural environment and thinking a little bit about what's the world like before this thing and how does it change the environment that I'm experiencing in that moment as it passes through. Um, this is a video by Duncan Sheik from a musical that was never produced, but I was fascinated by this kind of oily movement that he had in the background. Or during a residency in Finland, seeing the work of Jari Hamperna, where he creates large constructions in the middle of the room, but the real artwork is on the walls around the room because these animated constructions have lights in them that project shadows onto the wall. So those shadows, I think, had much greater effect on me than I realized at the time. This is a piece from an exhibition called "In Absence of Reason," where the exhibit started with this sort of large scale screen printed work and was accompanied by a series of inkjet and Shinkolay prints, where I used um, I used computer software to create a scale model of the structure that I was going to build, and then placed this smoke cloud inside of uh, of that structure, and then playing around with cast shadows on those pieces, and then finally building the piece to accompany the exhibit. And so I was thinking a lot about how we can think about well, climate change is the disruption within a closed system, the closed system of our Earth, but that we can also look at that same kind of thing on a slightly smaller scale if we're thinking about democracy or our society, but even on a much more personal scale, thinking about disruptions in a family system, how how do we manage these things? How do we um, contain them? What kind of structures do we put together to contain them? And so here I've used stud walls, but which are a structure that we use to create, the homes that we live in and are seemingly stable, but worked with them in a kind of nonsensical way. I continued to work with that in another exhibition called Flashpoint, where as the structures moved across the room, they became sort of more randomly placed and unstable. And while they did hold each other up, it felt very precarious. And then creating this sort of small fire that starts the creating a flashpoint for the challenges that we're facing. So then thinking finally here about flow as a gradual, permanent deformation of a solid under stress. So thinking a little bit about, again, how do we handle the things that are difficult? How do we put our finger on them? How do we understand those things? And at this point in time, so as my work has progressed forward, here we arrive at the time where the pandemic happened, and there's a whole new level of something difficult to handle that nobody's prepared for, that we began working with. At this time, I had written a proposal for a sabbatical, and the proposal was titled Dark, and I was going to create a series of images about how do you find light in a dark world. But what I didn't really realize is how much darker the world could get when I was writing that proposal. And I ended up having to postpone that sabbatical a couple times so that I was able to actually travel and do the things that I intended, but also, making sure that my program was stable and that my students were being looked after. Um, I was listening to a podcast when I was on a drive during this time by a woman who's the chaplain for the Maine game wardens. And she said, in speaking about grief, she said, walk fearlessly into the house of mourning. For grief is only love that has come up against its oldest challenge. And after all these mortal years, love knows how to handle it. And that put me in the mind of really thinking about love, of being curious about grief, of trying to think about the relationship between love and loss, and how loss or grief, whether it's the loss of an individual or the way that we had been living before, how those things wouldn't be so hard if we hadn't been living in so much love and so much wonder before. So one of the things at this time is that I realized that I really needed to get myself to work. I was finding a hard time trying to make anything, but I know that the only way to move forward is to actually work. So I set up a project for myself where I was going to work with a 12-inch by 12-inch square. I laser cut plexiglass letter forms that were much too big for the space that I was working with. And then decided that what I was going to print was a series of notes to myself of things that I know, but maybe I'm not paying attention to, that I need to remember. So, and the way that I was printing those was printing each letter sequentially with the same color that was mixed so that it would be very transparent, so that as you're printing, the layers of color build up to create more intensity. And the words themselves are difficult to read. So what happens is the printing is kind of a meditation, and the end result is sort of a visual mantra, something to look at, kind of giving a physical form to an abstract concept. So the image on the left is breathe. The one on the right, listen. I tried to also have a little bit of a sense of humor with these things. They weren't, I've had people like sort of lump categorize them as affirmations, and some of them are, but some of them are more directed, or more directions rather than things to reflect upon. But here, trying to have a sense of humor, sunshine exists, trying to remember that, when things are dark, sunshine does exist. This was also the winter in Akron, Ohio, when things get pretty gray and dark. And you have to remember that the sun is out there, or eat donuts, which is not so much about just eating donuts specifically, although I'd had some that morning. It was about giving yourself the freedom to have some pleasure, allowing yourself to enjoy life, even if things are really challenging. Celebrating, saying, hell yes, like there are moments where we deserve a little small celebration, or using transparency and difference in color to create a kind of hierarchy. So the image on the right is yesterday, today, tomorrow, and trying to emphasize the word today, so that we're really thinking about the fact that this is the moment that we're living in right now, and that the past and the future are non-existent really at that moment in time. So one of the things that became important to me during this time was sort of trying to reground myself. I realized that rather than finding light in a dark world, that it was important that you make light, that I make joy. And so I really tried to reconnect myself with nature, with the landscape. I started thinking a lot about looking outward to reconnect with the natural world while I was looking inward to reflect upon the things that I valued in the past and to digest new observations that I was collecting every day. I thought a lot about returning to ideas that I hadn't quite finished yet, like water, working with water, but also this passage that I had read with my students a long time before in a book called Visual Elements of Landscape by John Jackal. And in it, psychologist Edward de Bono is quoted as saying, a memory is what has happened. A memory is what is left behind when something happens and does not completely unhappen. So I like the idea of unhappenings. And for me, water was something that hadn't unhappened yet. It was something it is something that I always go back to. And so I began creating this series of prints where I was creating the illusion of a folded sheet of paper and thinking about identity and how identity is shaped through time, place, lived experience. And that with change as our constant companion, who we are, whether how we see ourselves or how are we defined by others, evolves with each passing moment. We continuously experience, witness, and ingest the world around us, cataloging and coding all of these experiences into our memories. So I was thinking about how do we package or fold experiences and store them away in our minds? And how do these experiences evolve and help our identities evolve, our outlooks, the ways that we interact with the world? What happens when we discover and explore moments that are secreted within our minds? How does revisiting the past shape our future selves? These were all things that I was asking myself while I was also reconnecting with lithography, which was my first love in printmaking. So I worked in relative stillness. I took a lot of time to look, fall back into sync with nature, with the natural world. I was rising with the sun and going to bed with the moon and stars. I was living in a red spruce forest and watching the tide fall anywhere from 10 to 12 feet every 12 hours, experiencing the change in the landscape with the tide and the change of the landscape with the seasons. Working in my studio, I had a lot of false starts, but it helped me reconnect with my voice. I began documenting moments that I didn't want to unhappen. I packaged them up, folded them. I treated them like three-dimensional objects, things that cast shadows upon us, giving physical form to time and experience. Prints, paintings, and sculptures are artworks, but the real artwork doesn't have a physical form in my mind. There's a region of discourse that exists between the artist who's created the work and the viewer who, in a way, recreates the work as they see it. The physical artwork is more of a prompt. Um, and it doesn't have to mean the same thing to either of us. The real artwork is this kind of visual dialogue in this region of discourse between the artist and the viewer, where we have two people who may have vastly different experiences connecting through the artwork. So I'm continuing to work with Note to Self. I am here, I'm digging deep, and with this new body of work, the unhappenings, I present my unhappenings as specimens, awaiting a moment of connection. If I'm lucky, they will resonate with my viewer, and maybe they'll contribute to how the viewer sees or thinks. Perhaps with this moment of shared humanity, the world won't seem quite so dark. So thank you so much for spending a little time with me here.
That was really wonderful. Thank you, Charles. So we have a bit of time for questions. So folks in the audience, if you'd like to pop those into the chat, I'll be happy to get to those. We do have a couple already. The first being, you listed some important teachers. Curious, who introduced you to printmaking?
Well, I think Mrs. Schotten introduced me to printmaking way back in middle school, but I don't think I was thinking about it. In high school, I did a print with Mr. Moore, but I still really wasn't thinking about printmaking. I remember being in college and I had a friend who was taking printmaking, and I was like, "What's that?" And he explained it to me, and I was like, "Well, that doesn't sound that exciting." And then I took a printmaking class and I was immediately completely hooked. So Claudia Esslinger is the person who I would say really introduced me to printmaking. I took a class that was a combination of screen print and lithography. Um, I really love the way it makes me work. Because I'm never actually working on the finished product until you're in the printing process. You're working on the matrix, the thing that you print off of. So there's a little bit of a separation that happens there. As a printmaker, I feel like printmaking is as much a thought process as it is, an art form, in that you come up with an idea, but then you have to figure out how to print it. So you have to take that idea apart, and then figure out how to separate it out into several different plates, maybe, and then sort of put it back together. And invariably, something goes wrong. There's always problem solving in printmaking, and so the work might change slightly. Maybe you can get it back on track and it ends up exactly where you want. For me, I think a lot of the time there are slight changes through the process, and those are something that's really welcome to me, because I really want to see the I like that printmaking contributes to the artwork as much as I do, and or process contributes. So in that initial class with Claudia, uh, I remember really enjoying screen printing, but then we got to lithography, and I was just immediately enamored. I love that it's this kind of it's magic. It's this fantastic combination between art and science. You completely get rid of your image at one point, and then it magically comes back. And by the end of that semester, my final project was a 10-layer lithograph that was many more layers than I needed to print, but I was so happy in the print shop over the course of that few weeks, watching that image develop and drawing on the stone sort of constantly to see the image evolve.
Wonderful. So, kind of on the other side of that, uh, do you have future plans for installation work?
Um, I have things that are sort of perking around in my head. Uh, so I have an exhibit coming up this fall, which is in a space that's pretty interesting. It's a gallery that's been being put together in the basement of a 19th century home. So it's got these really interesting sort of arches and this really great feeling. And so I've been thinking a lot about creating a form that kind of moves through those spaces and those arches, perhaps working with water rather than something as ephemeral as smoke this time. But we'll see. So stay tuned.
Yeah. So, because you are a teacher, instructor, professor, um, curious, what are some resources that you offer or recommend for folks who want to learn more about and or insert climate change activism into their work?
Gosh, that's a big question. Um, First of all, I think there's a lot of artists who are more and more who are working with this because it's something that's, it's been, uh, I mean, it's years uh, that it's been, a topic of discussion, but over that course of time, it just becomes more and more uh, weighty and expansive, and we see so many differences. So the first thing I think is just uh, doing a lot of research, looking in the newspaper, subscribing to feeds like the New York Times has a feed that deals with environmental news. I think it just off the top of my head, that's the first thing I would do is start doing some research.
Great. So something that we chatted about leading up to this a little bit is the importance of community within the printmaking process. So like
Mhm.
that and a couple of other specific art forms, there is specificity of community that comes into play. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of that for you and how maybe that shifted over our shelter at home orders and how it is blossoming again in current day?
Yeah, so I mean, community is incredibly important. So uh, as far as printmaking goes, it's an art form where presses are expensive. All of the you have to have so much equipment, and it could be really prohibitive. And there are really simple ways that people can set up studios in their kitchen or their basement or their garage. But to work with the heavier, more expensive equipment, joining a print shop immediately places you in a position of having a community. So a place like Zygote Press up in Cleveland, where you have a lot of artists working together. So one of the things that happens is we educate students in printmaking, and we're all working in the print shop. And so it's this great place where people come together, and you might be working together during your class time, but outside of class time, you have people from all different levels, whether it's somebody taking their first printmaking class or me working in the shop at the same time. So you always have somebody to bounce ideas off of, or you're noticing something that somebody else is doing, or you need some clean hands. So that working together is really important in printmaking. I went to the University of Connecticut for graduate school, and it was a small MFA program where there was only one of each of us for the most part in each of the media that we were working in. And I'm really grateful for that because critiques weren't about talking about prints. It was about talking about art and all different art forms, and sort of seeing the overlap and possible interactions and all of that. But when I graduated, I didn't necessarily have a really great community of colleagues, of printmakers. So I felt like I needed to make that happen. So I started um, going to printmaking conferences, the Mid-America Print Council and Southern Graphics, and getting involved to meet people and pushing myself to, at those conferences, go up and introduce myself to my heroes. And so over the course of my career, I worked a lot with both of those organizations, and it's been a really important part of my growth as an artist. Um, so, but as far as like, yeah, during the pandemic, we all had to sort of close down. I created an exchange for students, or a competition for students called Lockdown Prints, where students from all over the world participated in this competition. They had to invent a printmaking practice that they could do with what they had in their house. And so all kinds of different different ways of working came together. The one that won was a student who created carvings and then put them in her driveway, inked them up, put paper on top, and drove her car over them repeatedly to get the impressions. So even when we're separate, like there are ways that we can still hold on to that community. It is really such a wonderful thing to see community and print shops really back into a mode of full steam after, you know, moving through the intensity of and immediacy of the pandemic, but then sort of rebuilding afterwards.
I think that that is probably the very best way for us to close out. Thank you again, Charles, for the generosity of your time and talent. Thanks everyone for joining us for this artist talk by Charles Beneke as a part of our programming series for the Sequence exhibition. Special thank you to our curator, Christine DePiero Abbott, and a big thank you to all the other participating artists, as well as the Ohio Arts Council's board, the Ohio legislature, and the governor who supports the OAC, this great space, and of course, Ohio artists. Thanks everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you so much.